very well-known cases. That is the past system in apartheid Africa, in which the majority of the population were classified as foreigners, obliged to have a pass, obliged to cross checkpoints if they responded to economic incentives and moved to work, etc., etc. And finally, the West Bank, the occupied territories of Israel, where all the same machinery has now been introduced, indicating, for example, that the Israelis have no interest whatsoever in the economic development of the occupied territories. Their central concern is control. In essence, the state sacrifices the formation of a national labour market based on free mobility and hence accelerated economic growth to state control of the population. It sacrifices the economics and the welfare of the population to the politics of power. I'm getting it, I think, slowly. So that's the central theme of what I want to say. Before we leave the historical examples, I mention here one of the more interesting ones. That's the People's Republic of China. In 1945, Mao's famous speech on coalition government mentions that the industrialization of China is going to require hundreds of thousands of peasants to move to the cities. He says it without fear, without worry, as if this is an automatic process that is going to take place if China is to become modern and if China is to economically develop. It happened. That is to say, vast masses of people started moving under the impact of the extraordinary rates of growth of the first 5-year plan, 20% per year or so, on top of which was the Korean War, also forcing an acceleration of the growth of output. By 1955-56, there was panic among the leadership of China that they could not control the situation any longer because of the numbers of people moving to the areas of high growth. They introduced in 1956 a major wage reform and a system of differentiating between urban and rural. They introduced hukou, that is to say, those registered as legally entitled to live in urban areas thereby got a right to pensions, social security, health services, education, housing. You can't imagine a more extraordinary differentiation of urban and rural. I mean, I can't imagine how the rural population could even contemplate the discrimination against them. It is apartheid South Africa, in which they are denied access to these welfare benefits, but the urban population have them, and just by the accident of birth, nothing else, the same as the nation state, the accident of birth. It was enforced through a set of controls, non-transferable ration cards. That is to say, you could not move and draw your rations of food from one place to another. You had to stay put if you wanted to get your rations. And then the requirement for the permission to leave the rural commune, to enter the urban area, to travel, to work, to reside. And the police enforced this by raiding railway stations, bus stations, slum areas of the big cities and expelling people, doing actually what the developed country governments are doing at the moment with illegal immigrants, exactly the same response to them to try and defend political control. It didn't work. It didn't work because China was already beginning to grow so rapidly. And this is forces. I mean, on the one hand, you have forced labour. The only way you could cope with the system was to force people to move to jobs the government designed. That led, for example, to numbers of people moving to Outer Mongolia and to other remote areas, relatively underpopulated, in order to carry out the economic tasks. It didn't work. It needed forced labour, but it also produced the worker-peasant system. That is to say, it's delightful. This is the wonderful dialectics of Marxist nonsense. I'm not saying all Marxism is nonsense, but this particular case was the attempt to, as Mao said, to reconcile urban and rural. They would create a worker-peasant, that is, an unskilled labourer obliged to work in the cities without any of the benefits of being part of the settled urban population. And that produced in Shanghai a rapid growth in this category. no longer illegal, but downtrodden, as it were, legally. And that produced in 1966, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, a general strike. It was the alarm bells for the regime that the worker peasants would not tolerate this exclusion from the social benefits of being a settled urban resident. From the Deng Xiaoping reforms of the late 70s, all this began to wash away. China began to grow so fast it was impossible to sustain those controls. And the pursuit of economic growth required the formation of a national labour force responding to the changing economic geography, i.e., where jobs are expanding, workers will move there to get those jobs. And if they don't, the economy begins to break down. So you can't maintain those controls at all. And China is a very interesting case because the system collapses and had to collapse in order to sustain these very high rates of growth. Of course, that didn't mean they changed the legal system. They retained hukou, just as the Russians retained propiska, as a kind of instrument of torment for the population, even while they were forced to migrate. And yet, the benefits of migration, internal migration we're talking about, are immense. They are stunning. In fact, migration is possibly the biggest single factor in the world in redistributing income from rich areas to poor areas. You can see this admitted in a 2003 Chinese Ministry of Agriculture survey, which said the 192 million people who work outside the province of birth, and notice that qualification, it doesn't include the people who moved inside the same province. So it's a gross underestimate of the number of migrants. Of that number, 60%, they provided in remittances from their workplace to their original home registration place a flow of income equal to 60% of rural household incomes. That is enormous. That is to say, the Chinese peasantry only earned something like 40% of household income. The rest came from migration. So you can see here remittances being pumped out of the big cities, out of Shanghai, sustaining the rural population, and thank God for that, you might say. That is, otherwise the position of the Chinese peasantry would be very much more desperate. And you can see by inference that the cost of political control of migration was borne in a reduction of the welfare of the rural population, in the same way as immigration controls in Europe and the United States sustain the poverty of developing countries. Let's whisper it, because it's something that people don't want to look at. That is to say, if only we had free movement, we could begin to raise the incomes of developing countries far more rapidly than any of the other programs. To summarize then, this position, how am I doing on time? Okay. Do nag me, because I do go on. In sum, the history of government reactions to domestic migration provide a model for what happens, what is the position when we move into the international context and the emergence of a single global economy with immense potential for the radical reduction of world poverty. The fact that we